Baby oil, candles, a kiddie pool filled with baby oil. We're learning a lot about what was reportedly used in the alleged freak-off parties at the center of the sex trafficking and racketeering trial of Sean Diddy Combs. We're looking at all of the alleged freak-off supplies that we've learned about through testimony in court this week involving Diddy's former girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura, better known as Cassie. And what do the dozens of text messages that the defense is having Cassie read in court tell us about how Diddy wants the jury to see his relationship with the singer after her testimony that he allegedly abused her for years? We're on the case, presented by Law & Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. Let's get right into it. This week, we have heard from the star witness for the prosecution in its trial against Sean Diddy Combs. That star witness, Cassandra Ventura, dated Combs for a decade, and we've learned a ton about their relationship from her perspective. We have also learned a lot about the so-called freak-offs that are at the center of the government's case, and now we're learning about the supplies that were apparently used in the freak-offs. Again, the star witness is Cassandra Ventura. She and Diddy were in a relationship for 10 years. It ended in 2018. Cassie sued Diddy in 2023, and he settled that suit the very next day. That lawsuit was a major spark to the story that has brought us to what's playing out in court right now. This week, we heard Cassie tell her story to the jury. She says that Combs beat her, berated her, and forced her to take part in what has been called freak-offs. They're alleged drug-fueled sex parties involving escorts. Cassie said they were mentally and physically exhausting. She claimed that the freak-offs often left her with sores, UTIs, and needing IVs to recover. The jury has seen pictures of injuries from the relationship, Cassie says, like bloody lips and black eyes that she claims that Diddy gave her when they were together. The jury has also seen a video of Diddy assaulting Cassie in the hallway of an LA hotel in 2016 that was leaked to CNN. That's been seen by millions of people. That video, Cassie testified, shows her trying to escape a freak-off party. Before we get back to what is going on in court, I do want to take a moment to bring you a Law & Crime legal alert. Did you know that children are being diagnosed with serious conditions like type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? And there's research suggesting that ultra-processed foods are linked to these outcomes. Our partners at Morgan & Morgan are stepping in to fight to hold food companies accountable. They have decades of experience fighting large corporations, and they're ready to stand up for families who deserve justice. So if your child under 21 has been diagnosed with serious conditions like type 2 diabetes or non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, go to forthepeople.com/food. You can also scan the QR code on your screen to learn more. Now, the jury has also heard testimony from Cassie about the physical toll that she said freak-off parties had on her. This is an exchange from the transcript. When she was speaking with the prosecution, she said, quote, "Occasionally, I would get sores on my tongue from the freak-offs, the taking drugs, substances, and just friction in my mouth." She says that friction wasn't just from oral sex, but also from having her mouth on things covered with oil and other lubricants. The jury, we know, has seen an image from the freak-offs, but we don't know what that image really looks like. Our reporter, who has been in the courtroom every day, says it was only shown to jurors. It was not shown to those who have been sitting in the gallery. The defense, in its cross-examination, has been having Cassie read dozens of text messages that she and Combs sent to each other during their relationship. Messages like this one, trying to show that she was a willing participant in the freak-offs. Combs asks, quote, "When do you want to freak off, LOL?" And then Cassie replies, "LOL, I am just going up to change and put my ring in. I just picked it up. I'm always ready to freak off, LOL. LOL. The defense is trying to paint Combs and Ventura's relationship as one that was far more loving and consensual than Cassie's testimony presented thus far, and also prove that she wasn't forced to be part of the freak-offs, but she was a willing participant, and beyond that, she often organized them, they say. That she was the one who contacted the escorts often and put these things together. Now, one of the key pieces of evidence that we have heard about from the moment that the federal government announced their case against Sean Combs at the end of 2024 was baby oil. Federal prosecutors say they seized 1,000 bottles of baby oil in their investigation that they say belonged to Sean Combs. Now, when you look at the transcript from the cross-examination of Cassie this week, that baby oil came up a couple of times. In this instance, Cassie said during a freak-off they would fill an entire baby pool with baby oil. Cassie says that they specifically used Johnson & Johnson brand baby oil that she would get from a drugstore. And in this exchange, the defense attorney says, quote, "Just to clarify information not in the record, there were no drugs in the baby oil, correct?" To which Cassie replies, "Not the ones, no." Then the attorney says, "No, never in your experience, right?" To which Cassie says, "No." The defense attorney says, quote, "If you took drugs, you always took them orally, right?" And Cassie says, "Yeah." And the defense attorney then says, "You testified yesterday that you would heat up the baby oil, right?" And Cassie says, "Correct." That's a key exchange, not just because it paints a picture of just how much baby oil it would take to fill up a small pool and that they heated it up for a freak-off, but in October of last year, a civil suit was filed by a victim who went by Jane Doe, who claimed that the baby oil that was found in Combs' house was laced with the date rape drug GHB. Now, Cassie testified yesterday that she has tried different drugs during her relationship with Combs, including GHB. Here's the exchange. The defense says, quote, "It was a special time to also experiment with different drugs, right?" And Cassie replies, "We definitely experimented with different drugs. Yeah." The defense then says, quote, "And some took and some didn't, right?" Cassie answers, "Yeah." The defense says, "You tried psychedelics, right?" "Uh-huh," Cassie says. "And GHB?" asks the defense, and Cassie says yes, as well as she admits to doing ketamine. So GHB is something that Cassie says she took, but it wasn't, to her knowledge, laced in the baby oil. Another text shows that Cassie would go to drugstores, not just for baby oil, but for candles, saying, quote, "I'm going to Duane Reade to grab candles, and I'm going home to pack us a bag. Do you want my reg clothes, BTW, or just sweats? Then I can go check in and set up the room. I'll eat, take my vitamins, LOL, and get ready before I leave the house. Just want to know what you're thinking." After the testimony Cassie first gave about the alleged abuse she suffered at the hands of Combs during their relationship, you do wonder what these messages, showing that she would be part of setting up the freak-offs, whether they have an impact on the jury's perception of this relationship after what Cassie first told them. The text messages show that Cassie did a fair amount of shopping herself for these freak-offs. The defense presented her text messages of her going to sex stores, like a place called Pleasure Chest, where she said she would get sexual supplies, lubricants, and outfits. And you can also see in this part of the transcript, the defense points out that Combs apparently volunteers to go to a store to buy supplies. And they say, quote, "In fact, there were many occasions in which he was picking up supplies for the freak-off, right?" And Cassie answers, quote, "He picked up supplies." Yeah, that is another defense attempt to make the freak-off seem more consensually planned than what Cassie's testimony suggested in the first days that she was on the stand being questioned by the prosecution. Cassie also apparently went to another adult store, Hustler, and in this exchange she writes, quote, "At Hustler, about to check out, trying to find something to impress you, LOL, you." It's unclear what other video evidence from freak-offs will be submitted at this trial, which is expected to last more than a month and a half. Joining us now to talk more about what's happening in the courtroom is former prosecutor and current criminal defense attorney Safa Robinson-Ferrer. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. So there's all these items that we're hearing about that were used for these so-called freak-offs, the baby oil, the kiddie pool. Why is it important that the defense bring up that Cassie had these items and that she went and bought these items allegedly when she was, helping put these, according to the defense, put these freak-off parties together?
It's important for the defense because what they need to do, or what they're going to try to do, is essentially show that she was a willing and voluntary participant, that these freak offs was just a couple engaging in, sexually risque behavior, not that this was an instance of domestic violence, not that she was being forced to do these things. So the fact that she's testifying and the defense is cross-examining her, eliciting testimony that she went to the store and purchased these items herself, essentially would negate the prosecution's idea that she was forced to do these things. And the defense is really going to want to highlight that here because, again, their point is yes, he may have been domestically violent, but he was not holding her against her will. This was not, a sex trafficking case in which she was being forced to participate, that she, at her own will, was a willing participant to a point. And that's what the defense is really trying to crack at here.
There was also, because on the one hand, you have these instances where she went to like a Duane Reade, which for people not in the Northeast watching this is a New York City drugstore. And then she went to all these other locations, apparently to get certain items or clothing for the freak off parties. But then there was one point where the defense pointed out that Sean Combs apparently had volunteered to go pick up some items for a freak off and had volunteered in the past. Why does that matter?
It matters because it again goes to show that this was likely, and this is not my specific opinion, but that this was likely a couple that was just engaged in a certain sexual lifestyle. That he at times would go to pick these things up, that she at times would go pick these things up. And it's not uncommon for couples or individuals who are engaged in a lifestyle like this to do these things. So again, the defense is really going to want to hone in on that because their point is, yes, our client, he may be a violent individual, but this does not fit under the umbrella of racketeering. It does not fit under the umbrella of sex trafficking. These were willing participants. These were consensually relationships that were consented to between two consenting adults and other consenting adults who may have participated.
And I want to talk about the baby oil part of this because that, from when Sean Combs was arrested and the federal government announced their case, the fact that they say he had 1,000 bottles of baby oil, that was kind of a headline grabbing item. And that came up yesterday. Why, in terms of all the items that we're hearing about related to these freak offs, is baby oil important?
The baby oil is important because now we know, as we've been listening to the testimony throughout this trial, is that the baby oil was a very much relevant part of the freak offs, that baby oil was used during these freak offs, that she would lather herself or she would be lathered in baby oil. I would expect or assume that other individuals that were participating also, were using baby oil at the time. So it's very relevant. I don't think it's as relevant as people really want to make it seem.
And on the note of the baby oil, that there was a key part yesterday that got a lot of attention, and that was the moment that the defense pointed out that the baby oil was not laced with any drugs. Cassie confirmed that. I know that there was a civil suit that kind of touched on this, but why was that also notable when talking about this specific item that was apparently used in these freak off parties?
Why, like I said, I'm like, where does this laced baby oil come from? But why it's important here is because one of the things the prosecution is going to attempt to prove is that he used drugs in order to engage in these freak offs, that he drugged these individuals, including Miss Ventura. And Miss Ventura herself testifying that the baby oil didn't have any drugs in it, that it was just pure baby oil, negates what the prosecution, if the prosecution wanted to make that argument. So what's important here is that, Cassie's testifying, or Miss Ventura's testifying, that there were no drugs in the baby oil. And one of the things that the prosecution could try to say, but we know that they can't really say that now, is that these baby oil bottles were laced with drugs, and that's simply not true according to Miss Ventura's testimony.
The beginning of her testimony, when she was being questioned by the prosecution, we only have the transcript, but it was very raw, very emotional. Elizabeth Milner, who's our reporter who has been in the courtroom, has said that that is definitely how it came across, at least to her. Very authentic testimony. There were pictures that were shown of that Cassie Ventura says is because of Sean Combs, that she had a bloody lip at one, a black eye in the other. How is the defense doing thus far? Because I imagine if you're a juror and you see those images, you're going to remember those images. But then here's the defense saying, well, actually, you were a willing participant in this. You wanted this. How is the defense, in your opinion, from what we know, doing when it comes to trying to present that side to the story?
With regard to the violence and the photos of her injuries, that's really hurtful to the defense here. And I think, a lot of us and most people who would be seeing this, including the video from that LA incident, really could sympathize with Miss Ventura as a witness. And one of the things the judge will instruct the jury is that you cannot allow sympathy to enter into your deliberations. But the fact of the matter is that we're all human. These jurors are human. They are going to consider those things. And so, very tough for the defense to get over that hurdle. The prosecution, one of the things that they allege in the indictment is that he used threats of force and physical violence, and evidence and photos of Miss Ventura with these injuries. A jury could determine that this was the level of force that was used, that this satisfies that element of the charge, and go towards a finding of guilty.
Because I also know, and there might be some out there that'll say, well, she was in this relationship for 10 years. And some of these instances happened well before the relationship ended. So why didn't she just leave? And there's also a lot of experts in domestic violence and people who have suffered domestic violence that say it is just not that simple and it's far more complicated than that. If you're on the prosecution, how do you prove that point if you have the defense now saying, look, these texts prove that you actually were not someone who was being held against your will in this relationship. You were a willing participant in this.
What the prosecution's going to do, and what I'm going to do as a prosecutor, and what I expect that the U.S. Attorney's Office is going to do in this case, is call an expert witness on domestic violence syndrome, or on domestic violence and or battered woman syndrome, and explain to the jury and educate the jury on the patterns of domestic violence, why women don't leave, or why individuals do not leave automatically when they are in a violent relationship, particularly when they love a person, they've been with a person for a significant amount of time, and they have business dealings with that person. There is a theory or a pattern of domestic violence, and you have, the honeymoon stage, you have the violent stage, and there's a number of other stages that are associated with it. So I expect that the prosecution is going to put somebody on the stand to educate the jury as to why she may not have left before and why that does not matter.
I'm sure every jury is different, and we don't know what's going on through the minds of the people who are on the jury in this case. But you work in New York. I mean, typically, because I would think that people's understanding of domestic violence might be far better today than it was 20 years ago or even before that. I mean, typically, how educated are viewers on some of the nuances of domestic violence in New York in your experience?
Not as educated as you would like them to be. But there are people, and when it comes to the jury, during the voir dire process, the judge and the attorneys have questioned these jurors. I guarantee you they've questioned these jurors with regard to their views on domestic violence, if they themselves have ever been the victims of domestic violence or someone close to them have been victims of domestic violence. And so their experiences are going to come into that courtroom. They're going to go into that jury deliberation room as they sit and discuss the case and determine whether or not Mr. Combs is guilty or innocent. However, publicly and throughout my experience as a former domestic violence prosecutor and now criminal defense attorney, I'm still surprised at how uneducated people can be to domestic violence. And some people will take the position, well, why didn't this person leave before? Not fully understanding the magnitude of what it looks like to be physically abused, financially abused, and things of that nature, having children with an individual and why you may not leave because of that, and other safety reasons. On the other hand, you have a level of where accountability needs to be had for all of our actions and the situations that we may or may not put ourselves in. So it's a double-edged sword, but I'm very surprised that people in today's society don't fully understand the gravity of domestic violence.
You have in the direct questioning with the direct testimony that Cassie had, again, it was very emotional, very raw. She broke down at times, according to the transcript and our reporter who witnessed it live. What tone? Because then you have the cross-examination, and I imagine you could be very emotional that someone is questioning what you say you went through. But it seems like from the transcript that there were even like lighthearted moments, just knowing that it says like laughs in her response from what we've seen. I mean, how do you want, if you were on the prosecution team, you would want Cassie's demeanor to be on the stand as she's facing some really tough questions and evidence?
I'd want Cassie to do exactly what she's doing thus far. First of all, Cassie comes off as a very sympathetic witness. She's heavily pregnant.
Yeah.
Jurors are seeing that. There may be some level of sympathy with regard to that. Having or observing this pregnant woman explain some of the most physically violent times of her life and some of the abuse and trauma that she's previously gone through. So jurors will sympathize with that. And that's very, very difficult for the defense to have to get over. The defense, however, they're questioning, they may be pressing her on some questions, but she still appears to be responding to them in a neutral manner. She seems to be giving appropriate responses. I haven't seen anything to indicate that she's been combative with the defense, excuse me. And I don't think there's been any significant back and forth between the defense and Ms. Ventura, which as a prosecutor, I like that because I want her to continue to come off as truthful, honest, neutral, and just tell her story and just tell the truth. So I think she's doing a great job for the prosecution in terms of her demeanor and how she's handling being questioned by the defense.
And it seems like the defense are having her read these text messages, and there's moments that it says that she is, planning a freak off, that she wants to be part of a freak off, and they're trying to show that this relationship was not as, in their opinion, volatile as Cassie's testimony made it seem. If you're a defense attorney, I mean, do you want a gotcha moment during some point of the time that Cassie's on the stand? Like, what's the end goal of this testimony in the grand scheme of the trial?
You always want your gotcha moment. And for the defense here, it's that Miss Ventura, you were in love with this man. You did anything to be with this man. This is a man who was larger than life at one point in time and still is larger than life to an extent. He had power. He had money. He gave you whatever he wanted. He could have given you the career or did to an extent give you the career that you wanted. And you participated in this relationship. And in fact, you testified that you wanted to engage in these freak offs because you didn't want him to do them with anybody else. Again, showing that this was a relationship decision. This was a mutual decision or a voluntary decision that she made to begin this relationship with him, continue this relationship with him, and ultimately it didn't work out. And what I expect the defense is going to somehow try to introduce in a very subtle way is that when you could no longer be with him or when you couldn't just have him to yourself, you got upset, you departed from the relationship. Later down the line, or I think it was last year, possibly the year before, she files the lawsuit making the allegations. She didn't have to do that. She didn't have to disclose that. But long after they had departed, she had filed this lawsuit, which gave her a financial lump sum of money that put her in a better position than she would have been had she not filed that lawsuit. So showing that financial motivation for coming forward this amount of time later. I expect the defense is going to try to introduce that, but very subtly.
She is considered the star witness in this case because she was so close to Sean Combs for so many years and so close to a lot of the moments that are at the center of the government's case. Hard to know what the defense was expecting through this point in the trial, but has there been any moment that maybe they weren't expecting and would give them heartburn knowing that this is the star witness and thus far and they're trying to see that Sean Combs doesn't spend the rest of his life in prison?
Yeah, and the defense and both the defense and the prosecution, they have heavily prepared for this case. There isn't much that has been presented that either side didn't know about before they had put Miss Ventura on the stand to testify or before they began their cross-examination. Every time a defense attorney gets up to cross-examine a witness or when I ask a question, I already know the answer to that question. And so the defense is well prepared for that. I think the sticky and unfortunate part for the defense is they have to get around and they had to address the domestic violence factor. It would have been great for them to be able to say, well, none of that ever happened because it didn't happen, but it's clear that it did based on the Los Angeles video or the hotel footage that came into evidence and other things that have come into evidence. Really tough for the defense to try to get over.
And hard to know where this case is going to go next, who the next witness is going to be, what evidence is going to be, kind of that moment that we'll think back to. And maybe it's Cassie's testimony if Sean Combs is convicted, that was the moment that that the case for the government went well. But if there is a moment where Sean Combs is found not guilty, What do you see being the kind of the winning moment of what it could be for the defense?
The winning moment, in my opinion, is that if the jury were to take the view that this was just a relationship where it was a sexually deviant type of relationship, and this was something that they both participated in consensually. And it's really interesting because this company that employed these sex workers, they haven't come to an issue with the government. So it begs the question, if this is a company that is engaging in sexual practices or sex working or prostitution, where do they fit into this as well? So I think that if the jury were to take the view that this was a relationship, that they were mutually engaged or they were all mutually engaged, I could see them coming back not guilty on the sex trafficking charge. The hard part for the defense is that, and there's a catch-all, traveling via interstate commerce, state to state. That casts a wide net for the feds in order to, and what that does is essentially allows them a higher likelihood of guilt, because interstate commerce, we all travel through interstate commerce. We fly, we drive from state to state. So that's a very wide net for the prosecution that they can attach to. But if the jury does not view this as a sex worker prostitution case, I highly doubt they're going to come back guilty on the sex trafficking. The racketeering, there's going to be a question on that. There are a number of underlying predicate offenses that the government has to show, including arson and things of that nature, which there's some testimony that came in that would essentially establish those predicate charges for the racketeering. However, it's only been based on testimony as far as I've been aware. So the allegation that Mr. Combs blew up Kid Cudi's car is simply just been produced as testimony. Now, could this Mr. Kid Cudi come in and testify later? And could there be further information, further evidence on that? Absolutely, which a jury could determine based on that arson, based on the level of violence, that this was a racketeering, then he would be found guilty.
And I know you said from what it seems, from what we know, being on the outside of Cassie's testimony during the cross-examination, that it seems like she's holding up pretty well if you're the prosecution. But has there been any moment thus far, from what you can see for the prosecutors, that may have been a win for the defense?
Yeah, for sure. The one for the defense is going to be that in these text messages, she herself voluntarily, it appears voluntarily, engaged in the freak offs, where he's asking her, do you want to freak off, or are you ready to freak off? And she's like, I'm always ready to freak off. The text messages that indicate that she herself went to go purchase these items, the testimony from one of the sex workers that she was the one that paid him, and that they both instructed him on certain sexual acts, all go to hurt the prosecution's case, in my opinion, because it shows consent. So those are the things that I think are going to be difficult for the prosecution, and I think that the defense is going to continue to hone in on to show that this was a consensual adult relationship, and they may have just engaged in, again, sexually deviant lifestyle or things of that nature, but that this is not a crime.
And when you're doing a trial and you're trying to tell the story from your perspective and the point that you're trying to argue, because I think of during the direct examination when there were pictures of the abuse, of the injuries she said she had at the hands of Sean Combs. Of course, there's the video from 2016 at the Intercontinental Hotel in Los Angeles. And then you're hoping that testimony holds up through this cross-examination. How powerful are having the visual elements that could just stick? I just imagine that they could just stick in somebody's mind, where even if you're saying, okay, here's the proof that she was, part of this, she wasn't being forced to do anything, that you're still thinking about what it looked like with Cassie Ventura having a black eye in the image that you saw 48 hours ago.
Absolutely. Visual evidence is the most powerful evidence, and there's no better form of evidence than video evidence. That is the number one piece of evidence, and the jury is going to always remember that. The world remembers that video footage from that hotel, and most of the jurors, if not all of them, have seen that prior to sitting as a juror on this trial, and they've been asked the questions about this video and had they ever seen it. So that piece of evidence is absolutely crucial. And yes, the prosecution has moved it into evidence. It has been at fair play for questioning by both sides. The defense is doing their job right now with negating some of the things that the prosecution is trying to allege with respect to force, coercion, and violence. But the prosecution is going to be able to get back up after their cross-examination and redirect her testimony and address some of the things that the defense elicited that might not be the greatest for them. The other thing that the defense or the prosecution will be able to do at the end of this trial is get back up and play that video. Leave that video in the minds of the jurors. The prosecutors are going to go last during closing arguments. So the defense will go first, the prosecution will go last, and they will have the last word. I expect that they will play that video again. I expect they will show footage of these injuries or photos of these injuries and all of the exhibits that made it into evidence that show that Miss Ventura was beaten and that there was a significant level of violence in this relationship. And that violence, that threat of violence, that coercion, and all of the sexual acts and activity and transportation would require the jury to find Mr. Combs guilty.
I think at this point, the jurors have seen that video twice thus far at the time that we're recording this. How many times can the prosecution show that video?
Well, they've got to be careful not to bolster, but it's in evidence. So even the defense can bring that video up. If the defense, through another witness, wanted to say, hey, I want to ask you some questions about this video, the defense can bring it up and show it as an exhibit. Both sides can use it. And again, they can use it at the end of trial. And I expect that the prosecution will probably do that because that image will stay in the minds of jurors, and that is the most powerful piece of evidence. So they can continue to use it. Of course, they don't want to bolster, is what we call it, but it's fair game.
Yeah, I was wondering if it's something, if you're a prosecutor, you can't just press play every morning at the start of the day to get people to know. There has to be some purpose. Yeah, purpose to how you use that piece of evidence. Safa Robinson-Ferrer, always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for your perspective as we continue to follow this case.
Thank you so much.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.